Last month, when I gave a talk about Mastan, I mentioned that he was someone who had somehow gone under the radar in Ramanasramam publications. This month, I'm going to wave the flag and bang the drum for some slightly obscure Muruganar texts that I feel have also gone under the radar. I believe their relative obscurity is unjustified, which is why I want to speak about them today. I know that the books I will be recommending will not be to everyone's taste, but I do feel that they merit a much wider audience than the tiny one they currently seem to enjoy. Last month, I had to put together a presentation on a devotee of Bhagavan, Mastan, who only had 2 available photos. No such problem this month. There is a huge and very satisfying collection of Muruganar pictures available. Here he is sitting next to Bhagavan in the late 1940s. On the other side of Bhagavan is Mauni Swami, who wrote all the Ashram letters on Bhagavan's behalf in the 1940s. They would be shown to Bhagavan for possible corrections or additions before they were posted. And on the top left are 2 Muruganar photos from the late 1960s. Until about a year or so ago, there was a full-on corner of the Ramanasramam book depot that had discounted books, most of which were being sold at half price because nobody ever wanted to buy them. Amongst the items that seemed to be permanently on display there were 3 of Muruganar's poetry texts. Professor K. Swaminathan's Homage to the Presence of Sri Ramana, which is his partial translation of Muruganar's Sri Ramana's Sannidhi Murai, Sri Guru Ramana Prasadam, similar work by Muruganar that has been beautifully translated by Robert Butler, and Ramana Puranam, a work jointly composed by Bhagavan and Muruganar. This final one was translated by Robert Butler, Venkatasubramanian, and myself. Just to illustrate how forgotten and unavailable some of these texts still are, I went to the Ramanasramam book depot last week to find out if it still had any copies of Sri Guru Ramana Prasadam. The book had not appeared on the shelves there for months, so I just assumed it was out of print. If it was, I planned to offer Robert an Indian reprint to keep it available. It turned out the ashram still had hundreds of copies. It had just forgotten to put any on the shelves. I was probably the first person to inquire about the book and its absence for months. I'm not going to speak about homage to the presence of Sri Ramana today, but I will say before I speak about the other texts that Professor Swaminathan, seen here on the top left, had a love for and an appreciation of Muruganar's verses that was quite exceptional. He was primarily the editor of the 100 volumes of Gandhi's collected works, one of which is on the slide, and simultaneously the editor of The Mountain Path in the late 70s and early 80s. In the final years of his life, when I visited him in his Chennai home, I would usually find him immersed in Muruganar's poetry. As a former professor of English literature and a lover of Tamil poetry, he had a love for and an extensive knowledge of the important literary texts of both languages. But in his final years, his preferred reading material shrank dramatically until it was almost exclusively Muruganar. On one of my visits to his house in the 1980s, he told me, "It's the only material I feel like reading nowadays. The verses, on one level, are all about the same thing, Muruganar's relationship and experiences with Bhagavan, and the love and gratitude he feels towards him. But he somehow manages to express this slightly differently in almost every one of his thousands of verses. That's something which exactly expresses how I feel myself. Muruganar's 20,000 plus surviving verses continually surprise me with the number of elegant and different ways that a simple and basic idea can be articulated." In the early 1980s, Professor Swaminathan used his considerable influence and connections in New Delhi to persuade the central government to subsidize a 9-volume series of Muruganar's previously unpublished poetry that was entitled Sri Ramana Bodham. Sadhu, seen here top center with Muruganar in Muruganar's Ramanasramam, was the editor. The turquoise and brown cover on the right is one of this series. When it was completed, the 9 volumes contained over 18,000 of Muruganar's verses and retailed at 10 rupees each. In today's money, that's just over $1 for all 9 volumes, which collectively gave you 18,000 verses. And even at that bargain price, virtually nobody wanted to buy them. There was one printing that was mostly given away, and it's now out of print. A scan of the text appears on the Ramanasramam site. They don't think there are any plans to reprint the books again. Along with Robert Butler and Venkatasubramanian, I have brought out 2 volumes, Padamalai and The Shining of My Lord, that contain about 15% of these Ramana Jnana Bodham verses, which means that the vast majority are still only available in Tamil books that are out of print. As I said earlier, it's hard to get people interested in Muruganar's poetry, but I'm going to do my best with today's talk. I have spoken about Muruganar's backstory in YouTube videos on several occasions. Today I will just give a summary because I want the focus to be more on Ramana Puranam and other lesser known texts that contain Muruganar's devotional poetry. I will make sure that there are some links under the video for those who want a more comprehensive account of his life. For those who are not familiar with him, Muruganar, born 1890, passed away in 1973, is widely regarded as being one of the foremost devotees of Bhagavan. He is seen here in the center of the photo between Perumal Swami holding the sandals and Dandapani Swami holding the staff. The photo was taken in 1923, soon after Muruganar first met Bhagavan. Muruganar was instrumental in getting Bhagavan to compose the verses that comprise Oladu Narpadu and Upadesha Undiyar, 2 of Bhagavan's major philosophical poems, and he composed thousands of verses of his own that either praised Bhagavan, recorded his teachings, or expressed gratitude to Bhagavan for having established him in the self. His collection of Bhagavan's spoken teachings, Guru Vachaka Kovai, was edited and corrected by Bhagavan himself. Because of Bhagavan's hands-on involvement in this work, I personally regard it as being the most authoritative collection of Bhagavan's verbal teachings. Before coming to Bhagavan, Muruganar was a well-respected Tamil scholar who served on a prestigious committee that was compiling the definitive Tamil dictionary. He also worked as a school teacher and a private tutor. The earliest photo we have, dating from around 1915, is this group photo of the Tamil Dictionary Committee. Muruganar is the earnest-looking young man in the turban on the left. He was brought up in Ramanathapuram in what is now southern Tamil Nadu. I have put a little map on the bottom right of the screen to show where it is relative to Madurai. Tiruvannamalai is close to 400 kilometers north of Ramanathapuram. It was a visit by Dandapani Swami, his father-in-law, that prompted him to go to Tiruvannamalai in September 1923. When Dandapani Swami visited and showed him Aksharamanamalai, Bhagavan's 108 verses in praise of Arunachala, Muruganar immediately recognized that Ramana Maharshi was the guru he'd been actively seeking. Dandapani Swami, the very large man wearing the kaupina in the group photo, was a colorful character who managed Ramanasramam in the 1920s. There are lots of entertaining stories about him, but my favorite is that he briefly volunteered to be Bhagavan's body double on festival days, despite looking nothing like him. He would sit in Padmasana near the Ramanasramam gate on a raised platform. The throngs of casual visitors who walked past would assume that this imposing figure, sitting in Padmasana and wearing an orange kaupina, was Ramana Maharshi. They would prostrate to him and then walk on without entering the ashram. This kept the ashram relatively empty, allowing the people who were regular visitors to have better access. Bhagavan didn't mind this bit of subterfuge so long as there wasn't a sign next to Dandapani saying that this was Bhagavan. Muruganar decided to pay a visit to Tiruvannamalai and see Bhagavan. On the way there, he composed 11 verses in the Arunachalaswara temple. This gives me an excuse to put up some lovely old photos of the temple taken decades ago while Bhagavan was still alive. Most of the verses addressed to Bhagavan as Shiva contained pleas for grace. Muruganar has described this first the first visit and the background that led up to it in two of his other poetical compositions. This is what he wrote there. Will I, an unworthy ignorant one, ever be accepted as a devotee by Lord Shiva, who, as the divine guru with the wealth of grace, showed clearly to the world the greatness of Vachaka? And even if I get such a chance, will I be able to sing of the glories of his grace-showering feet in the same way as Tiruvachakam, Vachaka's most famous poetical work? This photo of the Arunachalaswara temple was taken next to Guhai Namah Shivaya temple. Bhagavan briefly lived there at the turn of the 20th century, and it was probably the place where he wrote the answers that were later published as Nanya, Who Am I? With these first few lines, we jump straight into the heart of Muruganar's spiritual quest. He had a strong desire to emulate Vachaka, a Tamil saint who lived and composed devotional poetry about 1200 years ago. Vachaka had sought a human guru so intently, Shiva himself had appeared and undertaken that role, granting him liberation. Afterwards, Shiva commissioned Vachaka to compose Tamil verses that praised him and then travel around the Tamil-speaking region singing them. The Tiruvachakam, the collection of poetry that Vachaka composed and sang, is regarded as one of the all-time classics of Tamil devotional poetry. When Muruganar showed up in Tiruvannamalai in 1923, he was hoping that Bhagavan would fulfill the same role for him. He was not merely seeking the grace of the Guru for liberation, he wanted Bhagavan to be his muse and to endow him with the ability to sing his praises in the same way that Vachaka sang about Shiva. Muruganar continues, like many other thoughts that arose in my mind, this thought a long time ago appeared and disappeared, like a flash of lightning manifesting in the sky. Then I heard from devotees who had redeemed themselves by taking as their support the grace of the one at Tiruvannamalai, who is the embodiment of true Jnana, and who shines as the flame of true tapas. When they spoke of the greatness of his grace, they melted in joy. Hearing them, I was lost in admiration and unceasing joy. This slide is illustrated by the old entrance to the Patala Lingam in the Arunachalaswara temple, where Bhagavan lived for 6 weeks in 1896. This is the place he was rescued from by Seshadri Swami when insects started to eat up his legs. Muruganar continues to describe what drew him to Bhagavan. The compassionate Supreme One, who is endowed with Jnana, then decided in his heart to be my Lord and Master. There was in me an intense longing to subside into the self that was prompted by the thought of the divine feet which abound in grace. So, like one who, suffering from thirst, comes across a Ganges of cold water, on an auspicious day, a golden day for my thirst, I went to Ramana Maharshi with 11 verses that began, leaving Mount Kailash, and met the excellent sage, the Jnana Guru, the ocean of Mauna, the bestower of Jnana. John?
Yes.
Can you plug my phone in? I don't know how long it will last. Oh. Muruganar took his verses to Bhagavan, who at that time was living in the small thatched hut that had been built over his mother's Samadhi shrine. Here it is, taken from two different angles, sometime in the second half of 1922. These are the earliest photos of Ramanasramam that have survived. Bhagavan is standing in the foreground of the top left photo reading a letter. I want to throw in an additional, entirely irrelevant photo since it is so unusual. The person who took the two views of the ashram that day took a third photo, the man floating on his back in the bottom right photo. You can see the similar handwriting on the two photos on the right side of the slide. I suspect this is Bhagavan floating in a nearby tirtham, probably Pandava tirtham. There is not quite enough information in the face to confirm this, but I've scrutinized it close up and it looks like Bhagavan to me. Pandavatirtham is a lovely little shrine located just behind Ramanasramam at the foot of Arunachala. There are several stories of Bhagavan swimming there. He took Rangan, one of his old school friends, there for an early morning swim when he was still living at Skandashram. And there is also a story of having a bath and a swim there at the end of a Giri production in the early 1920s. The colour photo at the bottom of the slide is a modern-day photo of Pandavatirtham taken in, I think, 2017. This is Muruganar's account of what happened when he met Bhagavan for the first time. Again, it's written by him. On the top right, there is a group photo taken at Ramanasramam in the late 1920s. Muruganar is third from the left at the back with a lot of vibhuti on his forehead and wearing a Brahmin thread. Below is an early photo of him taken from the mid-20s. This is what he wrote. In the same way that wax melts on encountering fire, on seeing his feet, my mind dissolved and lost its form. Like a calf finding its mother, my heart melted and rejoiced in his feet. The hairs on my body stood on end. Devotion surged in me like an ocean that has seen the full moon. Through the grace of Chit Shakti, the power inherent in consciousness, my soul was in ecstasy. And this photo, Muruganar, is on the bottom right. This was taken in the late 1920s. He continued, with an unsteady and quivering voice, I read the 11 verses. These are the ones he composed in the Arunachalaswara temple and placed them at his feet. At that very moment, he graciously looked at me with his lotus eyes. From that day on, the praises given out by my impartial tongue belonged only to him. Muruganar stuck to this declaration for the rest of his life. From that point on, the only topic he ever wrote about was Bhagavan, his teachings, and the experiences he had had with him. Muruganar concludes this account by writing, from the way he bestowed his grace, becoming my Lord and Master, I was completely convinced that he was Shiva himself. As my new owner, he made my eye and mine his own. Even if I get submerged in the miry mud of this world, I will not forget the mighty nobility of the bountiful bestower of grace. When I cite translations of Muruganar's words, I will put a reference on the slide at the bottom, at the end of the quote, but I won't be reading them out. Vidyanathan has recorded an interesting variant of this meeting, which he said he received from Muruganar himself. This is Ganeshan on a family group portrait from the mid-1940s. He's on the left. In September 1923, Bhagavan was still living in a small thatched hut that had been erected over his mother's samadhi. Muruganar felt unsure of the correct way of approaching him, so he remained for some time outside the hut. Bhagavan solved the problem by coming outside and saying, Jnana, what? In Tamil Nadu, this is a standard way of ascertaining what business the new visitor has. Here are two early photos of Muruganar below the group photo that contains Ganeshan. In response to this query, Muruganar began to sing the verses that had been composed by him in the temple, but emotion got the better of him. Tears welled up in his eyes and he was unable to proceed. Can't you read? Asked Bhagavan. Give it to me, I shall read it myself. Bhagavan then read out the poem. Up till this time, Muruganar had been very particular about annotating his poems with a specific raga or melody, since it was traditional that meters or themes had to be sung in a particular way. After this first encounter with Bhagavan, he was never able to sing his poems again. Muruganar's desire to get Bhagavan to approve of his intention to write poetry that mirrored Vachaka was not addressed on his first visit. That opportunity came on his second trip to Padamalai 3 months later in December 1923. He arrived with a poem entitled Tiruvembavai that began, which is on the left, let us bathe in and sing the glories of Annamalai Ramana who bestows his grace through his eyes. And since we are speaking of grace flowing from Bhagavan's eyes, here are 3 photos of Bhagavan looking directly at a camera. Tiruvembavai is the name of a very famous poem that Vachaka composed in Adi Annamalai more than 1,000 years ago. This is a lovely old photo of Adi Annamalai taken decades ago before the road was built up. You can just see the Adyanamalai temple set back from the road. The place where Vachaka supposedly sang his poem is about 200 meters to the left of this photo. When Muruganar showed up at Ramanasramam with a poem in praise of Bhagavan that had the name of one of Vachaka's most famous works, it was clear that Muruganar was hoping for a response from Bhagavan that would encourage him to continue writing poetry that echoed Vachaka. Bhagavan took the hint. Sadhu, seen here standing behind Muruganar, has described what happened next. He, Muruganar, one day composed a Tiruvembavai beginning with the words Padamalai Ramanam. Seeing that the verses of that song were replete with many sublime features, similar to Vachaka's Tiruvachakam, Sri Bhagavan playfully asked, "Can you sing like Vachaka?" Sadhu again. Though Sri Muruganar took these words to be a divine command from his guru, he prayed to him, "Where is Vachaka's divine experience of true jnana, and where is my state of ajnana? Only if Bhagavan removes my ajnana by his grace will it be possible for me to sing like Vachaka. By the mere talent of this ego, how is it possible to sing like him?" Here we see the two main aspects of Muruganar's hopes or expectations. He wanted Bhagavan's grace to realize the self, but once that grace had been received, he hoped that he would be additionally blessed with a flow of divinely inspired poetry similar to that which had come to Vachaka once he had been blessed and enlightened by Shiva. He recognized that he would not be able to compose Vachaka-like verses unless he was experiencing the same state as the famous saint. It seems that Muruganar was a little taken aback by the idea that he might be able to compose verses like Vachaka, even though that was clearly a strong desire he had. Sadhu continues with his story by citing some lines that Muruganar wrote later in response. "I said, where is my ignorant mind, which is like an owl blind to the bright sunlight, and which is darker than even the darkest darkness? And where is his, Vachaka's experience of self, Atmanubhuti, which surges as true jnana, devoid of dark delusion? To compare me with him is like comparing a firefly with the sun." This is Muruganar speaking. "As I said thus, I languished, and as I languished, that Lord who shines in my heart stirred my mind and made it blossom by his grace. And thus, without my doing, he composed the work Sri Ramana Murai, so that his true glory should flourish and shine exalted." Sri Ramana Murai, which can be translated as a testament to Sri Ramana's presence, is the title of the devotional work that Muruganar composed over the next 15 or so years. It was closely modelled on Tiruvachakam. As he suggested in this passage, he always felt that it was Bhagavan who was the true composer of the work, using Muruganar as his instrument. There is also an indication in this passage that Muruganar received the necessary liberating grace from Bhagavan to be the perfect instrument through which this work could be produced. I have mentioned a few times that Muruganar was seeking Bhagavan's grace to realize the self, as well as permission to pursue his literary quest. He knew that the literary journey he aspired to could only happen if it was grounded in self-abidance. So when did this self-abidance happen? Is there a single moment we can point to? Sadhu in his description of this meeting with Bhagavan in December 1923, felt that it occurred during this interaction when Bhagavan endorsed his desire to write in the style of Vachaka. Muruganar himself, though, hints at another incident that took place in Palakottu, an area adjacent to Ramanasramam, where many of Bhagavan's Sadhu devotees took up residence. In Sri Ramana Murai, there are 3 verses in which Muruganar mentions that Bhagavan gave him the experience of the self there. To set the scene, here are some lovely old photos of Palakottu. The one on the right features Bhagavan walking there in the 1940s. On the top left, there is a view of the Tirtham with an unknown Westerner standing on a rock. In the top right of this photo, you can just about see a small Ganesh shrine. In the 1920s, Muruganar briefly lived in this shrine. You can see a more modern 1970s photo of this Ganesh temple at the bottom of the slide. Here is the Palakatu Tirtham again, looking across the Tirtham towards Arunachala. The building on the far side was originally built by B.V. Narasimha Swami and later expanded by Paul Brunton. These two early occupants of the house are featured below the main photo. In Sri Ramana Maharshi, it is written that late one evening, Bhagavan invited Murugunar to walk to Palakatu with him to collect leaves for the leaf plates that were used in the Ramanasramam dining room. These leaves are not the banana leaves they use today. They were leaves of ordinary trees. They were subsequently dried, stitched together in a spiral pattern, and then used to serve food on. They were thrown away after being used once. I think the leaf collecting expedition was just a pretext to get Murugunar alone in the woods. Once they were there, Bhagavan sat him down, looked at him, and bestowed on him the direct experience of the self. And this is what Murugunar himself wrote about it. He took me to the forest with him on the pretext of plucking leaves to make leaf plates. There, with great delight, he destroyed my mind's restlessness by bestowing his glance on me. In the middle of the night, he subdued my divided individual consciousness, granting me the experience of the undivided Sivam, pure consciousness. Though Murugunar rarely spoke about this as an event that took place at a particular time and place, he was more than happy to write about the effect it had on him. On the right is Sri Guru Ramana Prasadam, the book I mentioned early on in the talk. It is one of the Murugunar books that was in the half price section and would actually disappeared from the Ashram bookstore shelves for many months because no one remembered to put copies on the shelves. This book, which I can highly recommend, contains hundreds of verses by Murugunar that describe his experiences of the self and the gratitude he feels towards Bhagavan for having bestowed it on him. Here is a sample that speak of the moment when Bhagavan looked at him. There are going to be 10 in total. I was blighted like a useless corpse, bereft of life and decaying, with no worthwhile goal to aim for, until the gaze of the unique master granted me his grace and engendered in my heart the realization of the self, the intangible beacon of consciousness. Entirely banishing lust and all the rest, my gracious Lord, Guru Ramana, true wisdom's flame, watches over me. Through his very glance, he revealed to me the upsurge of divine love, which is the savor of the experience of loving union with Lord Siva, sweet like the rich juice of a ripe mango. This is Robert Butler, the translator of Sri Guru Ramana Prasadam. The sitting photo was taken on my veranda about 15 years ago. The other one was from his early years at Ramanasramam in the late 1970s and early 80s. Robert has translated many of Murugunar's works into English. Apart from the ones I have already mentioned, I can highly recommend his translation of Murugunar's commentary on Aksharamanamalai. When this talk eventually gets posted on YouTube, I will provide links to all the titles I will be mentioning today. Here are the next two verses. It was the gaze of the unique master that revealed the eternally shining existence, the self-nature within my heart as my own experience, so that I woke into an awareness far wider than the normal waking state, that of Jnana, in which the delusion caused by the mind's divided consciousness is destroyed completely. As the dark prison of mental bondage crumbled and disappeared, I became his servant, finding joyous life in the open sky of his ambrosial grace. The knot that locked my consciousness to the physical body was sundered by the bright sword of my master's glance, and was no more. The knot that Murugunar writes about is the Chit Jada Granthi, the knot that binds consciousness to the insentient body. It's the erroneous idea that makes one believe that consciousness is bound to and limited by a body. This is Murugunar sitting in his room at Ramanasramam in the 1960s. The verses continue. When with the unerring arrow of his glance of Jnana, my Guru, the Supreme Lord, sundered the knot between my body and my consciousness, and my mind, transformed into the supernal sky of his grace, became clear and radiant, The veiling deception of bitter worldly bondage disappeared, and the truth I then saw was my own self. Sundering the fusion of consciousness and the insentient, that is the perplexed wandering mind, the acute grace-bestowing gaze of the great jewel, Guru Ramana, was consummated in me as the expanse of grace, rare mauna, such that the sorrow of birth that stems from self-forgetfulness was entirely abolished. Another reference here to the severing of the Chit Jadagranti knot. This is Muruganar in middle age, probably 1940s or 50s. The verses continue. Subduing me and bringing me under his control, he drew my consciousness to himself with the irresistible magnet of his grace. From the profound depths of his mauna, his gracious glance cleaved the knot of my ego's ruinous cravings in an instant. How great is the power of his piercing gaze. Lost in the fruitless round of birth and death, I surrendered before my master, and my heart became clear and serene through his gracious gaze. Then through the luminous spiritual practice in which I embraced his holy feet as the true path, I merged with the nature of the real, so that the disastrous error of forgetting my true nature was no more. And the final two verses in this sequence with a photo of Muruganar in his old age. It looks to me like it was taken outside the Mother's Temple at Ramanasramam, probably in the mid to late 1960s. Through the forgetfulness, pramada, that arose through the error of failing to inquire what was truly real, I reveled in the illusory existence of the physical body. But the Lord, through his glance of grace, united with my consciousness and brought me into harmony with true existence, the fullness of the open sky of the self. Through the grace-bestowing gaze of the Lord, of which I am totally unworthy, the miraculous and wonderful magic trick of the world's illusion fell away, and as both bondage and liberation faded like a daydream, I merged into the state of the self, which is my own radiant nature. The pramada mentioned in the first verse is a term that Muruganar often used. It indicates that one is in a state in which one forgets that one is the self and instead looks at objects, identifies with the observer of them, and takes the world that one is observing to be real. So these are just 10 verses from Sri Guru Ramana Prasadam. I have selected them because they express poetically Muruganar's claim and conviction that Bhagavan liberated him with his powerful gaze. There are hundreds more verses in this book that express Muruganar's state, his gratitude to Bhagavan for revealing it to him, and so on. I can highly recommend this text as an outstanding compilation of beautifully translated mystical poetry that fully embodies the essence and the experience of Bhagavan. On the top right, new slide, there's a photo of Muruganar, center, Viswanatha Swami left, and Kunti Swami on the right, sitting outside Muruganar's Ramanasramam room in the 1960s. Muruganar and Viswanatha Swami will feature in a story I'll be telling in a few minutes' time. At the bottom, Bhagavan and Viswanatha Swami are sitting together in the 1920s, while a young Viswanatha Swami appears in the bottom row by himself. Muruganar continued to work on Sri Ramana Sannidhi Murai throughout the 1920s and early 1930s. In 1927, for example, Muruganar composed a poem for Sri Ramana Sannidhi Murai that was modelled on Tiruvundiyar, a Tiruvachikan poem of 20 verses that narrates some of Shiva's divine exploits. Upadesha Undiyar, a work that is better known under its Sanskrit title, Upadesha Saram, was written by Bhagavan and included in this Tiruvundiyar poem. In 1933, an early but incomplete version of Sri Ramana Sannidhi Murai was being readied for publication. The manuscript was being read out to Bhagavan in the old hall. While he was listening to it, possibly for the first time, Viswanatha Swami spontaneously exclaimed appreciatively, Mugavapuri Murugan. Mugavapuri is another name of Ramanathapuram, the birthplace of Muruganar. Bhagavan then challenged Viswanatha to compose a verse of his own that began with these two words. Viswanatha tried for a while, but was unable to come up with anything. Admitting defeat, he asked Bhagavan to write one himself. Bhagavan agreed and came up with the following verse, which is on the left, the first half of which he wrote as if he were Muruganar. This is the verse composed by Bhagavan himself, whose text is on this slide. The first sentence has Muruganar praising Bhagavan, while the second half of the verse is a commentary on the Sri Ramana Sannidhi Murai project in general. It says, Arunachala Ramana, who dwells on the heart lotus, smiled and looked fixedly, poured forth grace and abundance, and completely annihilated my soul. So in writing the material that appears inside the quote marks, Bhagavan is asserting that he, Bhagavan, completely annihilated Muruganar's soul. Bhagavan then concluded the verse by writing, singing in this way so that the people of the world might be saved, Mugava Puri Murugan composed Sannidhi Murai, which is equal to Tiruvachikam. Now this is an extraordinary endorsement by Bhagavan. Having listened to the manuscript being read out in his presence, he first declared that the grace of Bhagavan had completely annihilated Muruganar's soul, and then he continued by stating quite explicitly that Sri Ramana Sannidhi Murai was the equal of one of the greatest and most revered texts of Tamil devotional poetry. And that's not all. After the book came out, Bhagavan happened to overhear a devotee making a disparaging comment about Muruganar. Bhagavan's response was to say the quote at the top of the slide, the very day that Sannidhi Murai came out, Muruganar became one among the very foremost of devotees. Michael James, writing in Ramana's Muruganar, a book that was brought out to commemorate Muruganar's birth centenary in 1993, has suggested, this quote underneath, by the words, the very foremost devotees, Sri Bhagavan was referring to poet saints such as Apar, Sundara, Sambandha, Manika Vachaka. That is to say, Bhagavan was not merely comparing Muruganar to the other devotees at Ramanasramam. He was putting him in the exalted company of some of the greatest saints in the Tamil literary tradition. If this sounds a bit excessive, remember that Bhagavan stated in writing in the verse I showed on the last slide that Mugavapuri Murugan composed Sannidhi Murai, which is equal to Tiruvachikam. When the first edition of the book was published in 1933, a public reading was arranged in the old hall. Devotees who had obtained copies of the first printing took it in turns to read from the text. Bhagavan also had a copy and read out portions when it was his turn. There are some politics involved here. Chinnaswami, Bhagavan's brother and the ashram manager, had not given his approval for the book to be publicly read in this way. He didn't like that the book had been privately published. He felt that only Ramanasramam should be publishing books on Bhagavan, so he was determined to sideline the book as much as possible once it came out. He let it be known that he didn't want to see any copies of the book in the ashram. Chinnaswami must have known that Bhagavan had approved of both the book and the public reading of it, but permission for the reading ceremony was not forthcoming. I should mention that events such as these had to be approved in advance by Chinnaswami. I will revert to the topic of who actually published Muruganar's books during Bhagavan's lifetime a little later in this presentation. First, though, I want to set the scene for this reading by pointing out a few features on this really nice photo on the right. It shows Bhagavan sitting outside by the ashram well, with the end window of the old hall behind him. The thatched structure next to the old hall is the old dining room and kitchen that was in use until 1938, when the new dining room was completed. When Bhagavan was inside that hall, Chinnaswami, seen at the top of the slide in his seat in the ashram office, would look across the well from his desk and keep tabs on all the activities that were taking place in the old hall. You can see the curve of the well next to Bhagavan. The office was a little to the left of where the photographer was standing to take this picture. Chinnaswami was quite strict about what was allowed in the hall, and devotees had to ask his permission to sing or read collectively from texts. On this occasion, once it was known that permission would not be granted, the devotees got round the ban on the Sri Ramana Sannidhi Murai public reading by putting brown paper covers on their copies and by writing Tiruvachikam on the front covers. That was an acceptable and approved text to chant and didn't need permission. Even Bhagavan had his own copy with Tiruvachikam written on its paper cover. Once the chanting started, Chinnaswami would have heard it in his office about 10 meters away, but the text would have sounded to him similar enough to the Tiruvachikam to be convincing. And had he gone to the old hall to check in person what was going on there, he would have seen a group of devotees, along with Bhagavan, all reading from a book that had Tiruvachakam written on the outside. This story was told to me by Annamalai Swami, seen in the top left photo, standing next to Bhagavan outside Bhagavan's bathroom. He was present in the hall when the disguised reading took place. I find this to be a really, really odd story. Bhagavan clearly endorsed Sri Ramana Murai. He supported Muruganar throughout its preparation and paid both Muruganar and the text a massive spiritual and literary compliment once it was completed. I find it a little sad that Bhagavan and the devotees had to resort to subterfuge to have this reading in the old hall. However, I will also add that it is yet another sign of how highly Bhagavan regarded both Muruganar and the text of Sri Ramana Murai, since he was clearly willing to go against Chinnaswami's wishes on this occasion. Bhagavan usually respected the ashram's rules that were made by Chinnaswami and encouraged devotees to do so as well. That he was willing to make an exception in this case shows how strongly he felt about the merits of the book and Muruganar's role in it. We are finally getting to the story of Ramana Puranam, which became part of the final version of Sri Ramana Murai in 1938. The story of how this happened is going to be narrated by Kanakamal, a devotee who was taught the meaning of Bhagavan's works by Muruganar in the 1950s. That's her on the right, along with a copy of the current English Ashram edition of Ramana Puranam, with Muruganar sitting next to Bhagavan on the front cover. First, though, a little preamble by me to set the scene. The first edition of Sri Ramana Murai was published in January 1933. Though it contained over 1,200 verses, there was an important omission. Tiruvachakam, the work it was modelled on, begins with a 95-line poem entitled Shiva Puranam, in which Manika Vachaka praises Shiva. Sri Ramana Murai had no equivalent poem as an introduction. Kanakama now describes how this gap was remedied. She wrote, "In the first edition of Ramana Murai, there is no poem corresponding to Shiva Puranam of Tiruvachakam. Since this work was patterned on Tiruvachakam, it seemed incomplete to that extent. So Muruganar started composing a poem on the same lines. His inspired pen quickly wrote 200 lines. At this stage, a doubt arose in his mind as to what would be the appropriate title for this work. The obvious title could be Shiva Puranam, since Shiva's name is dear to his devotees, and Ramana was the embodiment of Lord Shiva. But the verses were extolling the glory of the Lord as Ramana, so why not call it Ramana Puranam? Thus, tossed by doubt, Muruganar left the place, leaving the lines at Ramana's feet. When he returned in the evening, Ramana handed back the poems. A great surprise was in store for Muruganar. Ramana had distinctly written Ramana Puranam not only at the top of the work, but also at the top of each and every page. He had not stopped with that. He himself had composed 300 more lines and completed the work." Kanakamal continues, "When the second edition of Sri Ramana Murai was about to be published, these verses were also added. Muruganar had included a footnote to indicate that the first 200 lines had been composed by him and the remaining 300 by Bhagavan. After correcting the proof, he handed over the matter to Ramana. While going through it, Ramana saw the footnote and remarked, 'Are only these lines written by Bhagavan?' Muruganar at once saw his error. Were not the early ones too a product of Ramana's grace? He at once prostrated to Bhagavan and with profuse tears said, 'Nothing is written by me. Everything flows from your grace.' He then promptly deleted the footnote." On this occasion, I think that Bhagavan somehow consciously ran the power of the self through Muruganar's literary intellect, and out the other side came the poem Ramana Puranam. It was done indirectly when Muruganar was sitting in front of him in the hall, and more overtly and directly when Bhagavan, pen in hand, completed the work in Muruganar's absence. Something similar happened when Ganapati Muni was composing Uma Sahasranama in 1907. He had announced that he would have a public reading of the completed text at Pachiamankoil, the temple featured on the right, on a particular day. This was a temple Bhagavan occasionally had to move to when plague affected the town and its residents were ordered to evacuate. The evening before Uma Sahasranama was due to be read out, Ganapati Muni was still 300 verses away from completing the work. Bhagavan asked him if he wanted to postpone the reading, but Ganapati Muni insisted that he could complete the work in time. The two of them sat side by side, Bhagavan with his eyes closed and Ganapati Muni furiously scribbling away. When the 300 required verses had been written down, Bhagavan opened his eyes and apparently asked, quote, Nayana, that was his affectionate nickname for Ganapati Muni, has all that I said been taken down? Some transmission had clearly taken place that worked through Ganapati Muni's mind and completed the work in time for its public presentation. That's Bhagavan, by the way, at the top, sitting at Pachiamankoil in 1911. It's the only photo we have of him there. The long-haired boy on his right is actually Ganapati Muni's son. Ganapati Muni is featured at the bottom. I think something similar to this was happening with Bhagavan and Muruganar most of the time, not just when Ramana Puranam was being composed. Completed verses would often just appear in Muruganar's head without any conscious thought or desire or pre-planning. He would write them down on any scraps of paper that were nearby and just leave them lying around his room. Sometimes when no paper was nearby, he would write the verses in chalk on a slate. The disadvantage of this method was that when the next verse arrived in his head, he would just wipe the last verse from the slate with his sleeve to make room for the new one. I think a lot of verses got lost that way. Ramana Puranam was completed in early 1938, and it was included in the second edition of Sri Ramana Sannidhi Murai that was published in April 1939 by Ramana Padananda, a devotee who undertook the responsibility of publishing Muruganar's poetry. On the top right of this slide is a 20th century cover of Sri Ramana Sannidhi Murai from an era when ashram books didn't have very elaborate cover designs or photos. The remaining photos are of Ramana Padananda, Muruganar's publisher. In the bottom right, he is standing behind Muruganar, and in the one next to that, he is standing inside Ramanasramam, outside the Patasala and in front of the cowshed. That was when he was quite old in the 1960s. Ramana Padananda took upon himself the task of publishing Muruganar's verses, an ambition which brought him into conflict with Chinnaswami, the Ramanasramam manager. When Ramana Padananda declared in 1933 that he was planning to publish the first edition of Sri Ramana Sannidhi Murai, Chinnaswami attempted to veto the project on the grounds that only the ashram had the right to publish books about Bhagavan. When this order was conveyed to him, Ramana Padananda apparently responded with the words I've put up on the screen, even if all the Trimurtis, Brahma, Vishnu and Shiva came and stood in front of me and ordered me not to publish it, I would not stop. I am doing Bhagavan's work, and in all the three worlds, there is no authority higher than Bhagavan to stop me. Ramana Padananda went ahead and published a book. In the years that followed, he published many other titles by Muruganar. In fact, every book of Muruganar's poetry that was published in Bhagavan's lifetime, including Guru Vachaka Kovai, was published by Ramana Padananda and not Sri Ramanasramam. Fired up by a strong urge to disseminate information about Bhagavan in far-flung places, Ramana Padananda undertook tours of India, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, and Burma. Wherever he went, he would install photos of Bhagavan and encourage continuous chanting of Sri Ramana Sannidhi Murai. He used these tours to collect funds, which he used to publish Muruganar's writings and keep them in print. His publication activities, unfortunately and not surprisingly, caused him to be banned from Ramanasramam by Chinnaswami. When he returned to Tiruvannamalai from his various tours, he would have to stay in Palakottu and have darshan of Bhagavan there when Bhagavan visited on his daily walks. Here's an answer Ramana Padananda gave in a 1960s interview. Question: out of all the utterances of Bhagavan, which particular one do you remember? Ramana Padananda: Bhagavan often asserted, those who come here will be liberated, even animals. This promise of Bhagavan made a deep impression on my mind. Whenever I recollect it, I still feel an exhilaration. I can fully understand this exhilaration. It's always good to hear Bhagavan say so assertively that liberation is guaranteed. Reading this reply reminded me of a series of statements that Bhagavan made, which Muruganar recorded. I assembled them in a Padamalai section entitled Bhagavan's Promises and Declarations. Here are 3 of them. Abandon the drama of the world and seek the self within. Remaining within, I will protect you, ensuring that no harm befalls you. And the next one is my favorite. Seek my grace within the heart. I will drive away your darkness and show you the light. This is my responsibility. Like the children of an emperor, my devotees are heirs to abundant rejoicing. Padamalai is another great Muruganar text. It is mostly 2-line teaching statements that Muruganar had Bhagavan say, but there are also verses in which Muruganar expounds on the nature of the self and his direct experience of it. The Padamalai verses all come from volume 9 of Sri Ramana Bodham. After that little excursion into the experiences of Ramana Padananda and Padamalai, I want to return to the text of Ramana Puranam. The final published poem is 540 lines long. It doesn't have separated verses. Muruganar probably composed the first 232 lines, while Bhagavan himself completed the work by adding another 308. Muruganar never admitted where the join was after Bhagavan had questioned the footnote in which he had mentioned the fact that he composed the first portion and Bhagavan the second. But there is a slight stylistic change after line 232, which indicates that this is where Bhagavan's own contribution begins. This is consistent with the stories told by both Kanakama and Sadhu when they wrote about the proportion that each contributor wrote down. Before I look at what Bhagavan actually wrote, I think it is worth mentioning that this is the longest piece of poetry that Bhagavan ever wrote, and he seems to have composed it all in the time it took Muruganar to go for a walk. Aksharamanamalai, for example, is 218 lines long. Nalpadu is 168. It may not be as famous or as popular as these better-known works, but it still contains authoritative statements of Bhagavan's teachings, along with very interesting comments on Muruganar's state. Even though the final 308 lines were written by Bhagavan himself, they have yet to appear in any edition of Bhagavan's collected works. Before I start, please remember that Bhagavan is writing as if he were Muruganar, so there is an odd situation here of Bhagavan pretending to write like Muruganar, who in turn is attempting to write like Manika Vachaka. The end result is a style that is quite unlike anything else that Bhagavan produced. I want to start with this section that begins Bhagavan's contribution, since it is an emphatic declaration by Bhagavan of Muruganar's state and the journey he took to reach it. This is how Bhagavan opened his contribution once Muruganar left the hall. You, Bhagavan, concealed yourself within me, Muruganar, like the oil within a sesame seed, so that your presence within me could not be clearly discerned. Because of that veiling known as ignorance, the truth within my heart was cloaked entirely in deep darkness, and in this condition the mind somehow turned outwards. Through the power of multiplicity, which deludes and shows the world as the 5 sense perceptions, my mind, which knows them objectively as that, became bewildered, and, deeming them, the sense perceptions, to be profitable, sought them. That seeking, evolving itself into desire, became the seed that engendered the never-ending succession of births, bringing into existence the great and evil tree that is the illusion of birth and death. There's an interesting stylistic comment I can make here. There's a reference to a Tirukural verse in ancient Tamil text that Muruganar was particularly fond of. The original Tirukural verse says, "Desire is the seed that engenders unceasing birth to all jivas at all times. Because Bhagavan is imitating Muruganar's own style, he is including verses from texts that Muruganar might have used himself. Bhagavan continues, explaining how Muruganar found himself immersed in samsara. In my forgetfulness, I became a bird in that tree, my mind confused by good and evil actions. Looking around on all sides in my perplexity, I repetitively devoured its sweet and bitter fruits in vain, experiencing again and again unceasing suffering and enjoyment. And now, Bhagavan, still composing from Muruganar's standpoint, writes how he, Bhagavan, appeared as a sage to Muruganar, looked at him and, quote, revealed his holy feet, which is a way of saying bestowed liberation on him. In this state of disgust wherein there was not a trace of clarity within my mind, the king who is my very life, through his grace that is truth, free of the feelings of rejoicing and aversion, appeared as a unique sage in the city of Arunai to save me from death, worthless cur that I was, and through his compassionate gaze he revealed to me his holy lotus feet, infusing me with an abundant, unending flood of the ambrosia of being consciousness, so that my mind became still. This is Bhagavan himself confirming what happened when he looked at Muruganar. And Bhagavan makes it clear a few lines later that he did not merely give him the experience of a still mind, he removed Muruganar's sense of doership, allowing him to dwell as his own self-nature. He wrote, destroying in me the ideas of I and mine, you yourself became for me that I and that mine. You arose as the majesty of the luminous supreme, all transcending consciousness, so that the base part of my nature shrank out of shame to the size of an atom. Then, O Supreme Reality, you revealed that even that tiny atom was also false, as you dwelt in the quintessential purity of your own self-nature. This is a quite extraordinary endorsement of Muruganar's state and liberation from Bhagavan himself. Bhagavan is writing in elegant flowing lines of Tamil poetry that Muruganar came to him immersed in the swamp of worldly life and attachments, and that through his, Bhagavan's gaze and grace, Muruganar was established in, to paraphrase the last two lines, the quintessential purity of his own self-nature. Bhagavan almost never made public pronouncements that any of his devotees were enlightened. He might say something after they passed away, which was the case with his mother, Lakshmi the cow, and indirectly with Mastan, but I don't know of any other devotee who had this kind of certification while they were still living. There is one other person who was not exactly a devotee. Annamalai Swami once told Bhagavan that he had seen Sheshadri Swami perform some siddhis in town. After listening to the story, Bhagavan remarked, there is not a single place in this town that has not been visited by Sheshadri Swami, but he was never caught in Maya, illusion. Annamalai Swami and Sheshadri Swami appear under the photo of Muruganar on the bottom right of the slide. Other than Muruganar, this is the only other time that I think Bhagavan made this kind of public statement about someone while they were still alive. I want briefly to play devil's advocate here, to consider and then reject the possibility that Bhagavan, writing as if he were Muruganar, was merely formulating the claims that Muruganar made about his own state without actually endorsing them. There is a precedent for this. In the Virupaksha cave era, Bhagavan wrote a verse for Paramaswami in which the claim was made that Bhagavan was an avatar of Subramanian. Paramaswami asked him to do it because he wanted to sing a verse praising Bhagavan as Subramanian. Paramaswami actually believed this to be true. When the verse came to light about 20 years later, Bhagavan noted, the handwriting is mine, but the ideas are Paramaswami's. Paramaswami is on the right of the right-hand photo, Muruganar is between him and Bhagavan, and on the top photo, Paramaswami is seated on the left, with Muruganar sitting between him and Bhagavan. With regard to Bhagavan's statement on Muruganar's liberated state, I am certain that Bhagavan was not writing in this way just to make Muruganar happy. Bhagavan did, on several occasions, indicate that he accepted the claims of liberation that Muruganar repeatedly made in his poetry. Let me recap some of the incidents I've already told. I simply can't believe that Bhagavan would have flouted Chinnaswami's ashram rules and taken part in the reading of a text, Sri Ramana Murai, in which Muruganar repeatedly claimed liberation through Bhagavan's grace if the claims were not genuine. Secondly, there is no record of Bhagavan ever rejecting or criticizing any of Muruganar's statements in which he claimed to be abiding permanently in the self. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, there are a few occasions, such as the Mugavapuri Murugan verse and the Ramana Puranam lines I've just read out, in which Bhagavan has, unasked, spontaneously composed poetry of his own, whose subject was Muruganar's self-abidance. Muruganar is sitting on the bottom right in this 1920s group photo. I want to move on now to the philosophical content of Ramana Puranam. The original Siva Puranam was a work of praise rather than a philosophical text, but both Muruganar and Bhagavan in their respective sections devote space to carefully framed presentations of Bhagavan's teachings. In Bhagavan's case, in a few instances, he sometimes took verses from his other works and expanded on them. Most of you will probably be familiar with verse 30 of Ulladu Narpadu, which appears on the screen. Here is Robert Butler's translation of the verse. As the mind seeking inwardly through the inquiry, who am I, reaches the heart, and the one known as I bows its head in shame, the one appears spontaneously as I. However, that which appears is not the individual I, it is the perfection of the real, it is the reality, which is the self. Bhagavan expanded on this in lines 375 to 80 of Ramana Puranam, and this is what he wrote there, where the spurious, limited, and profitless ego, which declares that the fleshy body is I, bows its head in shame and falls away, through the knowledge gained by sinking within, by means of inquiry, who am I, conducted with extreme tenacity, there do you shine as the source of all things, the luminous sky of pure consciousness, which is not an empty void, but in which the deluded perception of the Triputis has subsided. There a deep rapture wells up, wherein bliss abounds. The three indented lines all qualify the previous line before the main idea continues with the new line that begins, there do you shine. This is clearly a massive expansion of the original idea, and it is, remember, written by Bhagavan himself. It's not somebody else's opinion or a commentary on the verse. If you want to take as your gold standard of reliability Tamil teaching statements that Bhagavan himself has composed, there's plenty to choose from in Ramana Puranam. For example, verses 14 and 15 of Ulladu Narpadu also have equivalents in Ramana Puranam, but they are not as different or expanded on as the example I've just given. There is also an extensive reworking of verse 15 of the Anubandham, the one about the legless man who says he will fight all his enemies if someone will just help him to stand up. Bhagavan may have picked this Ulladu Narpadu verse to elaborate on because Muruganar, just before he put down his pen to go out for his walk, had written 9 lines in which he narrated his own direct experience of the sentiments expressed in Ulladu Narpadu verse 30. Here is what Muruganar wrote about his experience of the rising and subsiding of the I. I have spread them out over the next 2 slides. He is the peerless primal one, the supreme peace of Mauna, who, merging as the heart within the heart, with no trace of the thought I, remains merged with each being through its I, existing and shining forth in all the beings of the world as their own self-nature. When the I thought does not arise and I unite as pure being with him, he remains merged with me, shining out as my very own fullness. However, the very moment I raise my head, thinking I, to perceive his ancient form, he sees my oddness, scorns me, and conceals himself from me. Bottom left photo is of Muruganar eating in his ashram room in the late 1960s. And Muruganar continues and completes his presentation on the I. If I then bow down my head and die, he flourishes within me, shining his light as before. Thus the majesty of the Lord will shine forth only before the I rises and after the I subsides. Who then will have the power to tell of his greatness? which can only be known through the God consciousness in which the I is absent, and not through the awareness in which the I is experienced. Ramana Puranam is not just a reworking of previous compositions. Here, for example, are lines 343 to 350, in which Bhagavan writes movingly of spiritual darkness and ignorance and the light of the self that ultimately transcends them. The wealth, the real that blazes forth as the radiant light of the self, is obscured and dimmed by the ego, the thought I am the body, which harasses and torments jivas through the obstacles whereby they are unable to satisfy unlimited and excessive desires, thus filling them with the poverty that is base and worthless ignorance. But you, source of my existence, shine within my heart, like a perfect storehouse of treasure that is beyond the three primal entities, so that I, your devotee, rise up resplendently and with exhilaration, totally free of that ignominy. The three primal entities mentioned near the end are most likely the triad of Jiva, Ishvara, and the world. Before I move on to my final Muruganar text, I want to include extracts from the first portion of Ramana Puranam, the lines that were written by Muruganar as he was sitting in front of Bhagavan before he went out for his walk. The Siva Puranam, the first poem in Tiruvachakam, starts with 3 sections whose lines begin with Tamil terms that can be translated as long live, victory to, and praise to. Muruganar follows this format for over 100 lines. The first 70 lines of the poem, Muruganar is merely retelling the story of Manika Vachaka's life and his association with Siva. But here are some of the lines from the subsequent sections that begin long live, victory to, or praise to. Long live the glory of the mighty one, Bhagavan, who, as the flood of bliss within my heart, caused my mouth to be silent to end my interminable babbling. Long live the holy feet of the Supreme Godhead, the Atma Swarupa, whose form is Jnana, within whom the entire world of external phenomena manifests as unreal creations of the mind. And here are 2 of the victory to sections. Victory to the holy feet of the divine player, who lovingly made me his own, destroying my age-old vasanas so that their powerful hold was abolished. Victory to the holy feet of him, Bhagavan, who slew the 6 inner enemies, which are impossible to combat, rooting out every last trace of the powerful effects of my karma, which are so hard to remove. And here are an interesting few lines from the Praise To section. Praise to the holy feet of the Lord of true Jnana, who never slips from the state of Mauna. Through the way in which he taught me the one glorious book that reveals the truth that shines in the heart so that its blackness was banished, he entirely destroyed in me the boundless appetite for other books whose worth is nothing. The book alluded to here is Oladu Napadu. Most of its verses were written when Muruganar asked Bhagavan to write on various spiritual topics. Once the work was completed, Bhagavan gave Muruganar lessons on the meaning of all the verses. In the first 2 verses of the indented qualifying phrase, Muruganar is saying that the truth which this book reveals shine in the hearts of all people. In the 3rd line, though, he is stating that the blackness of his own heart was banished as a result of the explanations of the verses of Oladu Napadu that Bhagavan gave to him. At the beginning of this talk, I promised to introduce you to works by Muruganar that were unjustly neglected. I hope I've done that without boring you with too many long quotations. I love this stuff, but I do accept that my appetite for it probably exceeds that of most ordinary devotees of Bhagavan. However, before I finish, there is one other text I want to introduce you to and share verses from. It's The Shining of My Lord, an anthology that has been primarily taken from Sri Ramana Bodham. Here are 10 verses that have been taken from the chapter on the heart. This is the Muruganar I love, proclaiming his liberation with an absolute certainty and conviction, and expressing his love and gratitude to Bhagavan for revealing it to him. He is my Lord who exists. He is my Lord who exists as the heart. When he quelled my consciousness, transforming it into that heart, I became the pure non-dual Lamb, Bhuma, that auspicious place which flourishes and shines in itself, the heart, and as itself. My Lord, existing as the heart, revealed to me that the heart alone was my real nature. I embraced the heart, consciousness, the supreme, the seat of grace. From now on, I will not sink into deluding concepts. I beseeched my Lord many times, my Lord, my Lord, my Lord, come quickly and take up residence in my heart. He retorted, when I am already established in your heart as the fullness that can neither go nor come, how can I come quickly? Remain still and it will shine. Having abounding love for me, my Lord abides in my heart as the productive wealth of rain that grants in abundance the unfailing harvest of supreme bliss, ensuring that the drought and famine of afflicting karma never comes chasing after me. When I enthroned in my heart the uniquely prosperous one, the King of true Jnana, who has been empowered to play the role of the Guru, tranquility of mind surged forth like a spring of holy water, and the affliction of anxieties caused by the veiling mind perished. My Lord, who flourishes and shines everywhere as the divine presence, sits enthroned majestically forever in his full glory in my heart, while he is welling up within me as the treasure of being, the perfectly full reality. Will the restricting ideas, the thoughts, I and mine, arise in my heart? By firmly planting his feet of grace in my heart, my Lord seated himself there. Then when he pulled out and threw away as weeds the vasanas that had densely grown there, the sprouting crop of meditation grew luxuriantly and produced a harvest of Siva Bhoga, enjoyment of Shiva. Having now consumed the Siva Bhoga, my life has flourished, becoming free from the affliction of anxieties. Was it I who established myself in the heart? Taking great pity on me, he, the Lord, whose nature is true Jnana, himself established me there, driving away the illusory and deceitful ego ghost known as I that was tormenting me. The invaluable and preeminent wealth is solely the feeling of fullness in the heart, a feeling whose form is the intense peace that arises through abidance in one's own nature. Only those who have totally come under the control of the self, having lost their ego self, by offering it as a sacrifice or entitled to this wealth, no one else. Now that my heart shines with a divine plenitude, the Swarupa of my Lord, who on this earth stopped me in my path and subjugated me, I do not value or regard as important the worldly wealth that is experienced in delusion and which possesses the flaw of impermanence. I only value the superb wealth of grace in the heart. This is a lovely photo from the 1960s of Murugunar with the then young lady Marlies, who still comes to Tiruvannamalai occasionally. I want to conclude with two final passages from Ramana Puranam, since they can serve as a kind of blessing and benediction on everything I've been talking about today. In the first one, Murugunar is asking that the power in Bhagavan's words eradicate our sense of separation from him and eliminate our bondage. He writes, the grace-bestowing word of our Lord, who abides as the self, becomes the means through which our suffering will end. Through his speech that parts us from the suffering that parts us from him, he gives us answers that enable us to be never parted from him. May those words, without ever leaving this foolish heart, shine out clearly, even in the deepest darkness, and abolish my bondage. And finally, a plea from Muruganar that we all be absorbed into Bhagavan's light. The hearts of those devotees who have gained the light of Jnana from the jewel-like Guru, whose radiant beauty shines forth, having brought to extinction the minds of those who are most qualified, will not cling to any other light whose nature is delusion, but will dwell triumphantly as the shining non-dual supreme space. May his feet enfold all this world of imaginary appearances that is reduced to nothingness by the powerful light of that supreme expanse. Apologies again if I have inflicted too much poetry on you. I read Muruganar most days and I'm always mystified that it doesn't seem to resonate with other people the way it does for me. Thank you for tolerating my Muruganar speeches.